Been lying fallow here on YouTube for quite some time. I guess I got disillusioned, burned out, frustrated, upset.
Talking with famous people.
At least half of the people who come here to talk to me about it do so not intent on learning, but instead on either negating, correcting, teaching. Almost everybody who comes here and talks to me about functions really should come here with the intent to learn. Yeah, but see, the thing is, it's not the case that in socionics or in whatever, right? Extroverted sensing is a cognitive function that is best described as a process, meow, 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 meow. So if you're describing that process incorrectly, then you're wrong. It's not you have an alternate perspective, it's that you're wrong. Let's look at an analogous example to explain exactly what's wrong with Brando's thinking here. The question might be, why do continents drift? Well, there's an expanding Earth theory and there's plate tectonics. Expanding Earth will tell you about a fault line, it's just a canyon. Plate tectonics will say, no, it's a fault line. Well, we can say it's a fault line in the tectonics model, but it's just a canyon in the expanding Earth model. Like we can say Earth is the center of the universe under geocentrism, or we can say SE is force under socionics. All it takes is for us to not care whether our explanation is actually correct. So socionics is wrong to describe it as force. It only seems like forcefulness because intuitives came up with socionics. So there's nothing forceful inherently about extroverted sensing. It is decisive. It is pull the triggery. But the reason it seems forceful is because with ENTPs, like, the guy who came up with socionics, extroverted sensing is the end of the deliberation process. It's the end of the talking it out process. So that's going to seem like force if you're an intuitive. But to describe extroverted sensing as forcefulness is wrong. It's just plain wrong. And it's displaying a lack of awareness of self and a lack of one's own cognitive bias in trying to determine how to model things. No, I mean, here's the thing, Eli. It's not absolutist. It's relatively absolutist, which, you have two choices. You're always going to be absolute on one side or the other. You're either absolutely relative. In other words, what's absolute is what is concrete to me, or you're going to be relatively absolute. What's absolute is what's true or logically sound for everybody, Symbolic reasoning is not about being accurate with reality necessarily. Being objective does not mean being more correct, being more concrete, being more linked to reality, okay? The words subjective and objective can have different meanings, sure. But we have to mean something when we say them, or else we're not really communicating ideas, okay? So the problem I have is this. People want to say, why should we disagree with Jung's definition of TI? He says it's subjective. But he doesn't say what he means when he says subjective. So does he mean it's simply of the subject? If so, that's non-unique to TI. It's true of all cognitive functions. And these statements are indisputable, right? So it's because of the way I'm phrasing them, we can be absolute. Sure, it's just language, it's just symbolic, it's just representative, but our capacity to map the world has proven time and time again that symbolic reasoning is extraordinarily effective in engaging with reality, even though it's detached from it. The theory of relativity better explains the universe than a geocentric understanding of the universe, okay? That's not in dispute. Now, granted, it's only true within its frame of reference. So, in other words, on the Newtonian physics level, Newtonian physics is right. On the Einsteinian physics level, relativity is right. On the quantum physics level, quantum physics is right. So, obviously, it's not absolute in the sense that it's not universally applied, but it's absolute within its frame. And that's what reasoning is. It's absolute within its frame.
Bum 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 bum.
So the problem with cognitive functions is people think that because reasoning is absolutely within its frame, that any set of reasoning within any frame is equally valid as if you're only talking about reasoning. But that's not the case, as Einstein's theory of relativity proves, or as, for example, plate tectonics proves. We've got plenty of explanations of things that for which have long been many examples of things needing an explanation, have gotten many multiple explanations until one of them proves correct. This is how it works, right? Are these concepts in conflict with one another? Well, see, that's the thing. Some of the concepts that Socionics has are in conflict with an accurate representation of cognitive functions, and some are not. My ideas are never in conflict with an accurate representation of cognitive functions, primarily because I'm always qualifying what I say. In other words, I'm doing an excellent job consistently of parsing my claims. If you're Socionics, they've got a bunch of dichotomies. They don't make a distinction between which of those dichotomies is a process-oriented dichotomy, which of those dichotomies is a behavioral correlate. They don't draw those kind of distinctions because they don't argue well. If you want to, go ahead. People who don't have debate experience, who don't really know how to debate, the thing that they think they're doing that they're calling debate, that is not debate. They're not competent. The laity can't do it. And something like modeling cognitive functions is very much about making a debate case. The problem with psychology in general is there haven't been debaters in there saying, whoa, 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 who's managing the framework and the meta framework here? You know? Nobody is. And that's why psychology is a mess. The thing is, understanding all this is frustrating because I'm talking to a vast majority of the audience that doesn't have debate experience. So I'm basically telling everybody, you guys don't think well because you don't really understand how to engage argumentation meaningfully. And nobody wants to hear that. You know, you don't want to be told that. You don't want to be told you don't think well. You, among everybody else that I encounter in the world, doesn't think well. Modern day debate guy thinks well enough to realize it's pointless trying to include non-debaters in debate, right? They don't know what the fuck they're doing. It's just a clusterfuck of disaster. It's like, imagine a bunch of people who all emerge into adulthood thinking they can play baseball, but none of them knowing the rules at all, right? And so they go, no, I get 6 swings and misses before I'm out. And you go, okay, that's a boat paddle, not a baseball bat. What are you doing? Right? It's pretty frustrating for people who actually know how to play baseball. The problem is debate comprises a meaningful component, supposedly, of the public discourse in general, something to which everybody should be party and is party. Unfortunately, almost nobody can meaningfully have a productive conversation about ideas without getting their egos involved. And a big part of the problem there is that I keep telling everybody I'm right. They're wrong. So everybody else is wrong. That's going to necessarily challenge everybody's egos. Unfortunately, it's the fucking truth. No, I don't think good argumentation and counter-argumentation can happen only through debate. I think that people who aren't accustomed to... people who want to debate, okay? People who fancy themselves good at debating but have no debate experience are the worst possible debaters. People who are interested in discussing ideas and stuff and have plenty of questions to ask and stuff like that. You know, the worst debaters are people who make a series of unsubstantiated claims, shifting ground from place to place, not being willing to be pinned down on what exactly their position is, dissembling and bullshit, you know? Just sophistry at its best, and much less than that at its worst. That's what I encounter most of the time, right? For people who want to have conversations with me, it's great. No problem. When you ask a question like that, KE, you want to have a conversation. But do you think good argumentation and counter-argumentation can only happen through debate? You and I might you and I might potentially have disagreed about that, except I agree with you that no, that's not the case. It's just the people who want to argue and don't have any experience. Those are the problems, right? Those are the problem people. People who don't want to argue, who aren't here to prove themselves righter than me, are not a problem. I think I smell the flavor of love. The thing is, people come in here with the wrong idea about typology. And it's a lot of times, it's even TI users who think, listen, you and I are both the same thing, Eric. We're both armchair philosophers doing random thinking about this kind of open-ended topic. You can no more claim exclusive rightness here than an astrologer can claim exclusive rightness with astrology. But the thing is, they're trying to play both sides of the coin there, because we all are in agreement that we're talking about something that's much more substantial and meaningful than astrology. That there's a real linkage that can be explained. The difference between something that is like astrology, which is there's a mechanics to it but no explanation, and something like typology is the explanation. Why it's this way. We have some of those tests in place now. In other words, with the TI polar questions, I can confidently say that a certain percentage of the population will answer those questions by either critiquing the black and white thinking in them, misunderstanding what you're asking entirely, not getting the idea of symbolic reasoning inherently, etc. And the answers will look like this. Who is my mother's sister in relation to me? Family? I'm already confident that I've got a couple of these elements that link well enough to very difficult to game skills that they comprise as close as you're going to get to a replicatable, ungameable personality test. Keeping in mind that human beings are open systems. In other words, once you learn something, then that changes how you approach things. So, this has always been the challenge of psychology, right? Is to hide from the people being tested in any given psychology test what they're being tested for.
Photo ding da, photo ding da.
This experimenter went out with a caveman mask on and caught some crows and just tagged them or whatever and then let them go. And then every time he went out again with this caveman mask on, all the crows would caw, caw, caw their danger, danger, danger call, because they had learned that the guy with the mask was a crow catcher. And this continued even after all the crows who had been alive when the original crows had been caught were dead. This links back to the prime directive, which is trying to make your map and your territory match. So when these crows, who normally went about their business totally unmolested, one day were caught by this man in a mask, it violated their map territory thing. They had not expected this. This was a new vector coming in that threw a loop into their whole worldview. They had adapted to say, not that we can no longer safely be on the ground eating food, but that guy is the problem. Which is a much smarter conclusion to draw, right? So, if I wanted to do the same test on the crows now, and I went out with my caveman mask on, it wouldn't work. Because they'd be too scared of me to let me catch them in the first place. I'd have to switch it up and do a new test, right? Well, most kind of psychology tests are like that. And what we're seeking in cognitive functions is something that's more robust than that. Namely, a skills kind of test that people cannot game. That they can't learn how to beat it. You got two ways to go. You could go pure empirics, like Big Five, but then the only thing you're linking to are after test correlates to test results. So all the test does is tell you how people score on this test tend to do in meow area or meow area. In that regard, it's somewhat predictive, but it's not explanatory at all. It doesn't explain personality at all. It doesn't even attempt to explain it. It just says people have it, and it expresses as these attributes that people don't really have, but that we convey onto people. It doesn't draw a distinction between really the inner life and the external life, the private life and the public life, which is weird because for introverts, the private life is the majority of their life. Given that you can replicate these TI responses, those kind of tests, if you're familiar with conditional logic rules and a contextual knowledge of the end of the test, then you can't. That's the weird thing, Kay. You can't. You can, an ESFP or an ENFP could learn that stuff hardcore, could study it hardcore, and they still wouldn't display. They might not display polar, but they definitely wouldn't display like first or second. It just it's a manner of how quickly they process. There's too many factors. In other words, it's a good raw test of actual talent. So you could get a room together and give everybody the same amount of instructions too, like the same amount of instruction ahead of time. Some people simply are not equipped to learn that kind of thing because it's a non-habituated attentional manner. And note this, SI. SI is a subjective knowledge function. So how does it play out as a subjective knowledge function? Well, one way that it does, and I don't usually use subjective and objective to talk about the knowledge functions, but it's appropriate for the epistemology functions, for both TI, FI, and SI and NI. One of the reasons it's a subjective knowledge function is it learns what it wants to learn. So I was with an ISFJ for 2.5 years, by the end of which she was still asking me what FE stood for, you know? I've been hanging out with Cameron for years now. He's still asking me what TE stands for, what type E is again. He forgets, you know? Why? Because they're not choosing to learn that stuff. NI is an objective learning function in the sense that NI can't help but knowing what's true, even when it's unpleasant. And that can be trouble for an NI Dom, you know? It can mean sort of the INTJ rage. Everyone's doing everything wrong. It's true. Everyone's doing everything wrong. Right. You see somebody like Oliver Linehan who chooses to learn cognitive functions and he's all over it because it's what they practice, you know? If you look at the way that schools teach language now, they use phonics. They used to use a system called whole language, which is better for intuitives and was made by intuitives because that's how intuitives learn language. In other words, we don't need to sound out words. We pick them up by reading. Do you think the primary purpose of incarceration is justice or keeping such people off the streets? Well, I think there are three distinct purposes for criminal incarceration. One is rehabilitation, one is retribution, and one is deterrence or public safety. So rehabilitation is the notion that somehow you're going to make them not behave badly in the future. Retribution is the notion that you're getting justice for somebody who's had wrong done against them. And deterrence is the idea that there's a general societal good from keeping dangerous people away from other people and deterring people from engaging in dangerous behavior. Of the three, retributive justice is the most logically valid, especially if it's restorative in some sense, which is not necessarily, but it can be. Rehabilitative justice is the most morally robust, I guess you'd say. And utilitarian justice is the most pragmatic. So depending on your cognitive function bias, you're going to prefer one angle of analysis on justice versus another. But those are the three kinds of justifications people use for criminal justice. When I'm in debate, I'm usually arguing that retributive justice is appropriate and should be bounded by proportionality. And that the argument should be about what comprises proportionality. and that rehabilitative justice is largely a justification for injustice, and that the pragmatic kind of justice probably has a lot less impact than people think. That's what I tend to think, you know. What flavor of justice do you like best? Justice is something we can be glad for instead of mad about.
Talking with famous people.